for many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on the hillside a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. The people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Excuse me, Joel, are we connected yet?
No, we're not going to be connected, but I'm recording your homily.
Okay. I'm sure most of you are aware that movies, books that deal with demons, devils, with the occult, and basically with all kinds of horror are just ever popular. There seems to be something, especially when it comes to the evil one and all that's related to evil, for some reason seems to engage us. All you have to do is go on Netflix and any of the other streaming services, and you can find all kinds of programming, movies, etc. Some of you may be old enough to remember when the movie The Exorcist came out. I was in college at that time, and in the college seminary one day after the movie came out, our formation director, priest, asked me if I'd be interested in seeing the movie with him. And I said, yeah, okay. So I went, and both he and I were like everybody else in the theater, just sort of, awestruck, mouths open, etc., just overwhelmed by all the things that were happening. And after the movie was over, we talked a little bit on the way back, and he was saying, well, it's theologically impossible for the devil to ever win against God. And said, well, you seem to put up a very good fight, nevertheless. And so the next morning at breakfast, he asked me, how did you sleep last night? And I said, with a crucifix in my hand. And I said, how about you? He said, I slept with the lights on. I said, so in spite of theology, we weren't leaving any stone unturned. That being said, I'd like to share this little bit with you about demon-possessed. Preaching about demons is problematic for the preacher, since we don't experience demons today, as Jesus did in his time. So says Michael Rognus, professor of preaching and professor emeritus of homiletics from Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. He goes on to say, however, that the demons Jesus confronts have three things in common. They cause self-destructive behavior in the victim. The victim feels trapped in that condition, and they separate the victim from normal living in the family circle. Sound familiar? Don't many of us suffer from the same kind of snares and burdens? So this sermon should be today about being released from the demons that possess us. So we have to try to identify what are the demons, what damage do they do, and how can Jesus free us from them? So that's what I will attempt to share with you. That movie, The Exorcist, and so many of these other programs, movies, etc., almost imply that the devil and God are on the same level, that it's an equal playing field. And they're always vying one against the other for our souls. But that's skewed because, as my seminary formation director said, God always wins. It's not an equal playing field because God is not the same as the evil one or evil in general. God is all good, all love, all knowing, etc., etc. And because God is God and the evil one is just a fallen angel, and all of his minions, that's all they are, they still have a certain amount of power to influence people and things, but they don't have the ultimate power. But people can still be influenced by evil, and even if you don't particularly believe in the existence of the devil per se, it's very difficult to explain why is there so much evil in the world and why do so many people seem to give themselves over to it, or why does it seem to fascinate so much in the literature down through the centuries if there's no reality to it. I think we're more familiar, though, when we talk about demons, of more, let's say, common things that assail us. But if we look at the man in the gospel, we don't know exactly how that possession really was built. Was it that this man at some point in his life decided that if he gave himself over to evil, that he would gain the upper hand on people? Sort of like in the story of Faust, how Dr. Faustus sells his soul to the devil in order to be able to have everything. And there are plenty of other stories that imitate that, so that they can gain the upper hand and be able to have all the wealth and the power and the influence, etc., etc. But in the end, there's a price to be paid, and if God doesn't intervene, then the person is damned eternally. So this man, whatever his affliction was, whether you can explain it naturally or as something supernatural, is certainly affected in such a way that his whole life has become one continuous misery. As that little snippet from Homiletics Online that I read to you says, there are those three categories. Number one, it's self-destructive behavior that emerges in this situation. And certainly that's what this man has been doing. In some of the other Gospels where this particular gentleman is described, we see that he also gashes himself with stones and throws himself down. And so he's battered, he's bruised. Plus, he's oftentimes given to howling in the cemetery where he lives. And so he's a Gentile because he's from the Gerasene territory, as the Gospel says, opposite Galilee. So in the northern part of Israel. And what's worse, for the Jews to behold this was totally disillusioning, precisely because they were not supposed to have contact with a dead body. It would make them ritually unclean. And so not only does this man have contact, he lives in the tombs. And so he is the most repulsive of beings as far as they're concerned. Yet Jesus, when he comes, he presents something to this one who comes to him and, at the top of his voice cries out, "What have you to do with me, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to torture us?" And Jesus knows from the beginning that this man is possessed. And so he orders the demon out. But first he names the demon. He asks what the demon's name is. And so the demon says legion. And in other translations, or in other versions of the same story in the other Gospels, he says legion, there are hundreds of us. So it's a reminder that this man is really in very, very bad shape. He needs to be freed. He needs to be liberated. And so Jesus expels the demon. But we see that the demons then want to go into the swine. They don't want to go back into hell, into the abyss, quite yet anyway. And so they ask to go into the swine, into the pigs that they're raising there. And so Jesus says, go, go ahead. And we see what happens. And of course, the swineherd would be infuriated at this because there goes their livelihood right down into the water to drown. And so that's why they run off into the city and into the countryside and say what's happened. In the meanwhile, Jesus is dealing with this man, and he's probably still quite battered and bruised, and maybe the disciples gave him some clothes to wrap around himself until he could go and get cleaned up and healed up and maybe then return to his own family. Because remember that not only was this behavior that he exhibited self-destructive, but also, for as long as that was going on, he had no freedom. He was under the influence of whatever was possessing him. And so he was the victim. He couldn't get out of it without an external aid, help, deliverance. And also he was isolated from everyone. He couldn't be with his family. He couldn't be in the larger community because he was smelly, he was gashed and bruised, and just nobody trusted him because, like it said, he could break whatever chains he was chained with or shackles that were put on him. So he was a force to be dealt with, and nobody would. So here he is now. And the people just see this. The disciples understand something. But the people of the territory, the Gentiles there, all they know is that they're living just drowned in the sea. And they don't want Jesus there because they're afraid, like the Gospel says. And why are they afraid? Because now here, the power of the God of Israel, of those who live in Galilee and in Judah, that they know of and that they've heard about, this God has invaded their territory. And this God has done something for this man that no one else was ever able to do. Whether anybody prayed over him or prayed for him to whatever God they were worshiping, nothing ever happened. Nothing changed. Then Jesus comes, and just like that, this power of God that he was ministering freed this man, put him into his right mind, and gave him hope, and gave him a sense of peace, and gave him the opportunity to be reconciled with his own. No longer dominated, no longer controlled, but free to choose life rather than death, because he was on a path towards death. And so they don't want that. The Gerasenes don't want it because they're afraid of it. What will this mean for us? Does that mean that, if any of our people are like this, that we can expect the same thing to happen? Does it mean that this power of the God of the Jews is going to change our whole way of life, turn everything upside down, make life uncomfortable for us because we're pretty comfortable the way we are? So Jesus hears them and he says, okay. And he goes back to Galilee. But the man knows now in his heart what the power of God really is, who the true God is. And that's why he goes to Jesus and asks if he can be with him, meaning, can he go with Jesus and become a disciple? But Jesus sends him back to his own people, saying, now go and tell them what God has done for you. You go back and be the witness, because after all, they will know who this guy used to be. And they would know that nobody in his right mind would have lived that way just to, attract attention to oneself or what have you. Because nobody felt sorry for him. They all were afraid of him. And then they would have to deal with the reality of this gift of God that was brought to them by Jesus and witnessed to by his disciples, and now the man. He's not given a name, but we all know who he is and what it is that he could now testify to. Many times we have to remember that we live in a world that is not very friendly to us as human beings. Now, there are lots of things that are right in the world and in our country and in our part of the world. There are many things that are good and many things that we're accustomed to. But we also have to accept the reality of the evil that exists. And again, whether you accept a personal evil, a personal devil, or think about it as just a force or a consequence of original sin, the truth is we all know that evil exists and that people are constantly affected by the evil in the world. The war in Ukraine, the violence that seems to continue to grow throughout the world or never quite ever goes away. When it seems to be dying down in one place, it heats up somewhere else. And the kinds of things we have to deal with, whether it's the temptations that we face, and sometimes the addictions that people struggle against, whether it's an addiction to alcohol or some other drug, or addiction to perhaps gambling or pornography, or to power, or to money, or to whatever else that seems to take us over. They're sort of like our demons also. Because if we are honest, and as they say in most 12-step programs, that an addiction is progressive and fatal. In one way or another, what possesses us leads us on the path to self-destruction. In my work as chaplain for the fire and police in town, plus in other things I've seen over the years in ministry, when someone is addicted, particularly to drugs, it's obvious what will happen. And particularly in our times, people afflicted by opioid addictions can be killed right away if the drug they're taking is laced with fentanyl. And that's happened again and again and again. Whether people do it because they became addicted from this substance while they were being treated for pain of some kind, or whether they've done it as thrill-seeking and then become addicted to it, the result's the same. And many times people who are addicted, particularly to chemical addictions like alcohol or drugs, or to other forces, like I said, pornography or what have you, those things enslave in a way that the people who are in it can't get out of it, usually without an intervention of the people who love them. And then it takes an act of the will on the part of the addicted one to not only accept the intervention, but then to cry out for the help that's needed and cooperate with it so that they can experience a kind of freedom. But sometimes it takes a real long time for people to break out of that. Sometimes it takes a major catastrophic event. Just like for the man. The catastrophic event was how he was living. And so Jesus zeroed in on that and called him with all of the love and the compassion and the mercy of God out of that into the possibility of a new life. But he had to make the decision, once it happened, of how he was going to live thereafter and what he was willing to struggle against with the help of God. What we have to do ourselves is, if we are afflicted by anything that tends to possess us, we have to be willing to come in humility to the Lord, to recognize that, and cry out for the Lord's help. Or if we have people in our families or among our friends who are addicted to something, it can even be relationship addiction, where they are such in an enmeshed relationship that they don't have a life of their own. And they are continuously making mistakes again and again about how they try to live their lives. And because we love them and we want to see them free, that we keep at it, we pray for them, but also try to act in a way to get them to see that they need to come, that they need to come to the Lord and be freed by his power to take advantage of those modes of healing that are available through all kinds of different 12-step programs. But you've got to be willing to do that and then work the program. There has to be an act of the will, otherwise you're never free. And all you'll do is continue to isolate and continue to feel yourself a victim and continue down the path of destructive behavior. And so, if we just for a moment look at Elijah in the first reading. Elijah was suffering from a couple of things. Elijah was suffering because they were out to get him. They were out to get him because what it alludes to is, in the previous chapter, he has had this, he's squared off against the 450 prophets of Baal who were calling on Baal, their god, to come down with fire and consume the sacrifice. And because all of the people, because of Ahab and Jezebel, who were their leaders, had abandoned Yahweh, and Elijah felt himself to be the only one who was still faithful. And after the fire comes down onto the offering that Elijah had prepared and consumes everything, the offering, the altar, the water in the ditch around it, he then orders the slaughter of the 450 priests of Baal. And that's why Ahab, but particularly Jezebel, was out to get him. And so he runs for his life. And every time he's spoken to, why are you here, Elijah? And he's, basically spells out. He is convinced that he is the only one who's faithful. He's the only one who can, defend Yahweh, because everybody else has abandoned him, except for Elijah. And so God has to remind Elijah. In a sense, he has to intervene in Elijah's life, so that he doesn't go down a continuous pattern that will become self-destructive, being eaten up by his own sense of importance and his own self-righteousness, that would eventually lead him away from Yahweh, thinking that he's the only one that can do anything. And so he does accept that, and his life then goes on to become what it was meant to be, and he continues on his mission faithfully. You and I may not be afflicted by any of these particular things, but we may know people who are. Have people in our family, friends, or neighbors. And we may feel afraid, reluctant to deal with it, to bring it to anybody's attention, to invite people into a more living and loving relationship with God, to be liberated, to be free. And there could be all kinds of other things that we are kind of enslaved by, whether it's something in our politics or about our faith, whatever it might be, that we are so enmeshed and so enslaved that we judge everybody else, and we're not free either, and that we continue to be isolated. The Lord calls us today to the awareness that he wants to name whatever it is that's afflicting you and me, possessing us in such a way that we aren't fully alive, that we aren't fully engaged in our faith, that we continue not to be witnesses but obstacles to other people embracing Christ and embracing his love and embracing the freedom that he offers us. And so we need to take the time to examine our own consciences to see if we are dominated by something that keeps us from being fully alive in him. And to ask the Lord for the grace to, first of all, admit that, and secondly, to work in us so that what Christ gives to us through our prayer, through our study of our faith, through the study of Scripture, through our worship, and particularly through the gift of himself in Holy Communion coming to us, to be again our living reminder of the Lord who loves us and whose desire is to see us become fully alive through his love, through his presence. That we would be open to what it is that he can do for us and wants to do for us, for the glory of his name and for our salvation.